The Detroit skyline stretched into the night, a mixture of old industry and new ambition, a city that had been built, broken, and rebuilt again, but never lost its spirit. Avery Carter had spent his whole life here, watching the city change, watching it push people like him to the edges, watching how no matter how much progress they claimed, some doors never really opened for black men. Avery was 34, a firefighter, a job he had dreamed of since he was a kid. He had worked his way through the academy, top of his class, stronger, faster, smarter than most of the guys in his unit. But no matter how many fires he put out, no matter how many lives he saved, there was one thing he couldn't fight. The way they looked at him, the way they waited for him to fail, it had started small. The jokes, the way they called him affirmative action behind his back, the way he always seemed to get the worst assignments, the ones nobody else wanted, the ones that made him prove himself again and again and again. Then came the silent treatment. The shift where nobody talked to him unless it was about work. The way his team would make plans to grab drinks after work and somehow never invite him, and still he swallowed it down. Because that was the job. Because he had worked too hard to quit now. Because he had learned a long time ago that black men in white spaces had two choices: work twice as hard or get out. But then came the Maple Street fire, and everything changed. It was past midnight when the call came in. A house fire on Maple Street, one of those old neighborhoods that had been mostly forgotten, where the city stopped fixing potholes and the hydrants were so old they barely worked. By the time they pulled up, the house was almost gone. Flames crawled through the windows, black smoke pouring into the sky. A woman stood on the sidewalk screaming, "My baby's inside, please!" Avery didn't hesitate. He grabbed his gear, ran toward the door. But then, "Carter, wait!" It was Lieutenant Briggs, the commanding officer. Avery turned. "We don't have time." Briggs shook his head. "We wait for backup." Avery's stomach dropped. She said, "Her baby's inside." Briggs's face was unreadable under his helmet. "It's too risky. Too risky." That was when Avery realized Briggs wasn't saying it was too risky for the team. He was saying it was too risky for Avery. Because in their eyes, he wasn't worth the risk. Because if something happened, if he didn't make it out, he'd just be another black man who made a bad decision. And that was when Avery snapped. He ran inside anyway. The heat hit him like a wall, smoke burning his throat. He moved fast, weaving through the flames, calling out, "Hello?" A cough. A small cry. Avery turned toward the sound, pushing into the next room, and then he saw her. A little girl, maybe 5 years old, curled up in the corner, face covered in soot, eyes wide with fear. Avery dropped to his knees. "I got you, baby girl." She clung to him, tiny hands gripping his jacket as he scooped her up. The flames closed in. Avery barreled toward the exit. Smoke burned his lungs, his legs screaming for relief. Thinner burst of air. He stumbled onto the front lawn, gasping, the little girl in his arms. The crowd erupted. The mother screamed and grabbed her child, sobbing. And Avery, he looked up, looked at Briggs, at the rest of the unit standing there watching. And he saw it. The way they weren't celebrating, the way they weren't clapping him on the back, the way they looked at him like he had broken some unspoken rule. Because he wasn't supposed to be the hero. He was supposed to stay in his place. The next day, they found a reason to write him up. They called it insubordination. Said he had disobeyed orders. Said he had compromised safety. Avery sat in the firehouse, staring at the report in his hands, rage curling in his chest. They wanted him gone. He knew it. And maybe before, he would have let them have their way. Maybe before, he would have walked away, found another station, another department, another battle. But not this time. This time, he was done playing by their rules. That night, he called a reporter, a black journalist who had spent years covering corruption in city institutions, and he told her everything. The way black firefighters were treated differently, the way promotions were handed out like favors to the white guys, the way they let that house burn because they didn't want him to be the one to save it. She listened. She took notes. And the next morning, the story broke. The city exploded. The mayor ordered an internal review. Activists marched in front of the firehouse. And Briggs, he was suddenly very, very quiet. Because the world was watching now. Because they couldn't sweep this one under the rug. And Avery, he was still standing. They offered him a deal. A quiet transfer. A promise that things would get better. A chance to walk away with his job intact. Avery thought about it. Then he looked at the city. At the kids who would grow up wanting to be firefighters. At the people who needed to know they deserved better. At himself. And he said, I'm not going anywhere. Because heroes didn't run. And this city still needed saving. The cold Cleveland air cut through the city like a blade, the kind of winter chill that seeped into your bones and stayed there. Avery Carter pulled his firehouse jacket tighter around his shoulders as he stepped out onto the sidewalk, his breath curling into the night. It had been a year since Detroit, since he had put his career on the line to expose the racism inside his department. He had thought he could fix it, thought he could fight from the inside. But the system had fought back harder. The report had come out, the mayor had promised change. There were press conferences and statements, investigations and temporary suspensions. And then, like always, things went back to normal, except for Avery. Because once you were labeled a troublemaker, once you refused to stay in your place, the doors started closing. So he left, packed his bags, took a new job in Cleveland, told himself this time he would just do the work. That this time, he wouldn't get involved in anything bigger than fighting fires. But some battles find you no matter where you go. Cleveland Station 17 was different from Detroit. Smaller crew, older equipment, and a firehouse culture that felt like it was frozen in time. It didn't take long for Avery to realize that the same old patterns existed here too. That black firefighters still got the worst shifts. That promotions still seemed to pass them by. That inside this firehouse, in this city, the old rules still applied. Stay quiet, be grateful, don't cause trouble. Avery told himself he could handle it. That he could keep his head down. But then came the call from Grandview Heights. And everything changed. It was 2:32 a.m. when the alarm rang through the firehouse. A house fire in Grandview Heights, one of the wealthier suburbs on the edge of the city. A neighborhood where most of the fire crews looked like the people they were saving. When Station 17 pulled up to the scene, the house was already an inferno. The family-wide upper class, a mother, a father, and two teenage sons stood outside watching everything they owned go up in smoke. And then the mother screamed, "My father's still inside! Upstairs!" Avery felt his stomach drop. The fire was already pushing past the flashover point, the stage where everything inside ignites at once. It was suicidal to go in, but it was what they were trained for. He turned to Captain Hensley, a heavy-set white man who had spent the last month barely acknowledging Avery's presence. "We gotta go in," Avery said. Hensley hesitated. "It's a lost cause." Avery froze. Because this was not how things worked. Not here. Not when the person inside was white. "He's still breathing if she can hear him," Avery argued. Hensley looked at him. And then a small smirk. A look that said, "You want to be the hero? Go ahead." And then a command. Go then, let's see if you make it. The heat was unbearable the second Avery stepped inside. The walls were crumbling. The floorboards groaned beneath his weight. He moved fast, weaving through the smoke, searching, and then a sound. Coughing. Second floor. He pushed forward, made it to the stairs, his vision blurry from the heat. And then he saw him, an old man, maybe in his late 70s, trapped behind a fallen beam. Avery didn't think, didn't hesitate. Just moved, lifted, pushed, pulled the man free. And then a crack, the floor gave out beneath them. Avery fell through the second story, slamming into the burning debris below. Pain exploded through his shoulder. His radio crackled. "Carter, you good?" Avery gasped for air. He grabbed the old man, hauled him onto his back, his body screaming in pain. "I'm coming out!" he shouted. But there was no response, because there was no rescue coming. Because Avery was alone, he made it to the door, to the outside, to air. The family collapsed in relief as Avery placed the old man on the ground, gasping, coughing, shaking. And then he turned to his crew, to Hensley, to the men who had never planned to pull him out, and he saw it. The way they stood there, waiting, wanting him to break, wanting him to quit. And in that moment, Avery understood they had sent him in alone on purpose, had left him inside, had been willing to let him die because he was the problem, because he had spoken up in Detroit, because firehouses talked and his reputation had followed him, because this was punishment for not knowing his place. And now he had a choice. That night, Avery sat in his car. His body ached. His shoulder was bruised, probably dislocated. And his mind? His mind raced. Because he knew what came next. If he filed a report, nothing would happen. If he stayed silent, nothing would change. But then his phone buzzed. A text from Maya Wallace, an activist and journalist he had met in Detroit. Still fighting the fight? He stared at the screen. Because that was the question, wasn't it? And in that moment, Avery knew his answer. He wasn't running anymore. He wasn't backing down. He texted back. "Yeah, and I got a story for you." 2 weeks later, the story broke. Cleveland firefighter alleges sabotage, negligence in life, threatening blaze. It exploded. News outlets picked it up. Protests followed. And Station 17? They tried to deny it, tried to discredit him. But Avery? He had evidence. He had truth. And this time, he wasn't alone. By the end of the year, Hensley was gone. The department was under investigation. And Avery, he was still here, still fighting. Because some people ran into fire, and some people became it. The streets of Atlanta pulsed with life, the city humming with the weight of history and the beat of something new. Danielle Carter stood on the steps of Peachtree High School, her breath slow, steady, controlled. She had been a teacher for 7 years, had seen the system from the inside, had fought to make sure her students got more than just a lesson plan and a test score. She had always known that being a black teacher in a majority white school came with its own set of unspoken rules. But this year was different. Because now, the rules were being written in ink. It started with a new policy, a memo from the school board hidden beneath legal jargon and careful phrasing. Danielle sat in the faculty meeting listening as Principal Warren, a man who had never taught a day in his life, stood at the podium. "We want to ensure that our curriculum remains neutral and balanced," he said smoothly. We've received concerns from parents about the teaching of divisive topics. Danielle felt her stomach tighten because she knew what that meant. History, but not too much history. Discussions, but only the polite kind. And above all, no mention of racism unless it was tied up neatly in a bow, a thing of the past, a relic instead of a reality. She folded her arms. "So, what exactly can we teach?" she asked. Principal Warren smiled like he had been waiting for that question. "The new guidelines will ensure that we focus on a shared American experience zone that doesn't place blame on any particular group." Danielle laughed under her breath. "Right," she said, "because slavery, segregation, mass incarceration, that all just happened by accident." A few teachers shuffled uncomfortably. Warren smiled thin. "We simply want to avoid unnecessary controversy." Danielle leaned forward. "History is controversial." His jaw tightened. "Then maybe you should reconsider how you approach it." And just like that, the line was drawn. Play along or risk everything. For a while, she tried to toe the line. She still taught about the civil rights movement, but she noticed the way the lesson plans had been rewritten. How the focus had shifted from protest and resistance to compromise and understanding. She noticed how Malcolm X had disappeared from the curriculum entirely. How textbooks mentioned Martin Luther King Jr., but only the safe quotes. How black history was shrinking piece by piece until it became something fragile and hollow. And then came the book ban. Danielle walked into her classroom one Monday morning and noticed something. Her bookshelf was half empty. Gone were the copies of the 1619 Project. Gone were the essays on redlining, systemic racism, police brutality. Gone was every book that made students question the world around them. She stormed into Warren's office, slamming the door behind her. "Where are my books?" she demanded. He looked up, unfazed. "Miss Carter, the district has deemed certain materials inappropriate for student use." "Inappropriate," she echoed. Warren exhaled, setting down his pen. "You're a good teacher, Danielle," he said. "I don't want to see you get caught up in politics." Danielle stared, because there it was. The warning, the reminder that she wasn't here to teach. She was here to make sure the students stayed comfortable. She walked out, and that night, she made a decision. The next morning, she walked into her classroom with a stack of photocopies. Not books, just papers, just words. The truth. And she placed them on each desk. Her students, confused at first, began reading. And slowly the room filled with something electric. A girl in the front row raised her hand. "Miss Carter, this isn't in our textbook." Danielle smiled. "No, it's not." And the next day, she did it again. And again, until her students started asking the questions they weren't supposed to ask. Until they saw the world not as a sanitized version, but as it truly was. Until the principal called her into his office once more. "You're being insubordinate." Danielle leaned back in her chair. "I'm being a teacher. You're pushing an agenda. I'm teaching history." Warren sighed. "Danielle," he said, softer now, "this could cost you your job." Danielle's jaw clenched. She thought of her students, thought of the way they had come alive in her classroom. And she realized something. This wasn't just about teaching. This was about what kind of world she wanted them to inherit. So she sat up, met his gaze, and said, "Then fire me." That night, she posted the full story online. She included every detail: the book bans, the curriculum changes, the way history was being rewritten in real time. She went to bed wondering if anyone would care. By morning, her phone was on fire. The post went viral. Parents started calling the school board. Students started protesting. News outlets started asking questions. And suddenly, Peachtree High wasn't just a school anymore. It was the center of a fight that was much bigger than Daniel. The school board tried to ignore it, tried to wait it out. But then, teachers from other schools started speaking up. Then, black parents started coming forward with stories. Then, the nation started watching. And when the pressure became too much, the district backed down, the books came back, the curriculum changes were reversed, and Danielle kept her job. But more importantly, she had changed the game because now her students knew the truth. And once you knew the truth, you never saw the world the same way again. The Chicago wind cut through the streets like a blade, the kind of cold that made even the toughest souls pull their coats tighter. Danielle Carter stood at the entrance of Southside Academy, her breath curling in the frigid air as she stared up at the old brick building. It had been a year since Atlanta, a year since she had put her job on the line to fight against erased history and sanitized education. She had won that battle, but the war? The war had followed her here. Danielle had left Atlanta for a new opportunity and offered to teach at a prestigious private school in Chicago's South Side. It was a school built on legacy, a place where wealthy black families sent their children, where the walls were lined with portraits of history's forgotten revolutionaries. For the first time in her career, she thought, maybe this time I won't have to fight. Maybe in this school a black teacher wouldn't be treated like a threat. Maybe here she could just teach. But systems don't change just because the people do. And Southside Academy, it had its own battle lines. It started with the guest speaker. Danielle had invited Malik Thompson, a well-known activist, to speak in her class. Malik was a former journalist, a Chicago native, and had spent years exposing corruption in the education system, particularly how black schools were underfunded, overpoliced, and set up to fail. She thought it was a perfect lesson until she got the email from Headmaster Collins. Subject: Guest Speaker Approval. Danielle, I appreciate your passion for teaching history, but I need to remind you that Southside Academy maintains a non-political stance in the classroom. While Mr. Thompson's work is important, I'm afraid we cannot approve his visit. Let's focus on less divisive material. Best, Jonathan Collins. Danielle stared at the screen. Less divisive. Like history wasn't inherently political. Like black students weren't already living through the consequences of that history every single day. She took a deep breath and then she ignored the email. The next morning, Malik Thompson walked into her classroom. The students leaned forward in their seats. They listened. They asked questions. And for the first time, they heard the unfiltered truth about their own city. Malik talked about Chicago's redlining, how black neighborhoods had been systematically cut off from wealth and resources. Talked about school closures, how the government had shut down 49 black schools in 1 year, calling it budget cuts. Talked about how policing and education had become two sides of the same coin, setting up black children to be criminalized instead of nurtured. The students took notes like their lives depended on it. Because in a way, they did. And by the end of the lesson, they had questions. Why don't we learn this in history class? Why don't textbooks talk about how racism is still happening? Danielle saw the fire in their eyes, and she knew she had just done exactly what the school feared. The next day, she was called into Headmaster Collins' office. He sat behind a polished mahogany desk, the kind that felt like it had existed longer than the students themselves. Danielle, he started, his voice calm. I saw that Malik Thompson spoke in your class yesterday. She crossed her arms. Yes. You directly ignored my email. She tilted her head. I don't remember seeing the word forbidden anywhere. Collins sighed, rubbing his temples. This school isn't like Peachtree High, he said. We're not trying to erase history, but we have donors, parents, expectations. If they believe their children are being taught radical ideologies, we lose funding. Danielle leaned forward. And if these kids don't learn the truth, they'll lose something bigger. Collins stared at her for a long time. Then he exhaled. You're on thin ice. She smiled. Then let's hope it doesn't break. But the real war started a week later. One morning, Danielle walked into her classroom and noticed something off. Her classroom posters, the ones featuring black historical figures, protest movements, and radical voices, were gone. Her bookshelf, the one filled with texts about black resistance, literature, and history, was empty. Her curriculum binder, the one she had built over years of research, was missing. And there, sitting on her desk, was a printed list. A list of acceptable materials for her class. A list that contained exactly 0 books by black authors. Danielle went still, because this wasn't about Malik Thompson. This was about control. This was about making sure even in a black school the lessons stayed whitewashed. She clenched her jaw, and she got to work. That night she wrote a new curriculum. Not a compromised one, not a watered down one, but a full, unfiltered, unapologetic black history course. And instead of waiting for permission, she printed copies, handed them to her students the next day. Take this home, she told them. Read everything. Talk to your parents. Ask questions. And they did. And suddenly the school had a bigger problem. Because now, the parents were getting involved. A few days later, Southside Academy's boardroom was packed. Black parents, black students, black alumni, and Danielle? She stood in the middle of it all, watching as they demanded answers. Why are you censoring black history? Why are our kids learning a version of America that doesn't include them? You think we don't notice? And suddenly, Headmaster Collins was the one on thin ice. Within a month, the board reversed the ban. The books came back. The posters went up. And Danielle? She became more than just a teacher. She became a movement. She wasn't just teaching history anymore. She was making it, because this wasn't just about a classroom. This was about the truth. And no matter how hard they tried, they couldn't erase it. The small town of Ashford, Mississippi, had 2 sides sewn for those who belonged and one for those who didn't. The railroad tracks that split the town weren't just steel and gravel. They were an invisible wall, a reminder of who held power and who was merely tolerated. Ruth Carter had grown up on the wrong side of those tracks. Her father had worked at the cotton mill until his back had given out, and her mother had cleaned the houses of the very people who sneered at her in town. Ruth was used to the looks, the whispers, the way shopkeepers followed her when she stepped into their stores, but she had always believed in something better. She was 16 when she got the job at Wilson's Pharmacy. It wasn't much sweeping floors, stocking shelves, ringing up customers when the owner, Mr. Wilson, stepped out. But it was work, and in Ashford, work meant survival. Her first few weeks passed without trouble. Most customers ignored her, barely looking her in the eye as they placed their purchases on the counter. That was fine. She wasn't there to make friends. Then, one afternoon, a woman entered with her son. The boy couldn't have been older than 7, his blonde hair neatly combed, his small hands clutching a dollar bill. He walked up to the counter, placing the money down with a bright smile. "A cherry soda, please." Ruth returned his smile, taking the bill and turning toward the soda fountain. She had barely filled the glass when she heard it. "Get away from her!" The boy's mother rushed forward, yanking him back with such force that the dollar bill fluttered to the floor. "Don't you ever take anything from one of them?" she hissed, her eyes filled with disgust. The boy looked confused, his gaze darting between Ruth and his mother. "But she was just—" I said no. She dragged him out of the store, the door slamming behind them. The soda remained unfinished on the counter, the glass sweating under the harsh summer heat. Ruth bent down, picking up the dollar bill. Her fingers trembled, but not from fear. She had seen racism in 100 ways, but there was something different about watching it pass down like a family heirloom. That night, she told her mother what had happened. Her mother sighed, pressing a gentle hand against Ruth's cheek. "You can't change them, baby, but you can decide who you want to be." Ruth didn't answer, but she knew she didn't want to be silent. The next day, she walked into Mr. Wilson's office. "I'd like to quit," she said. Mr. Wilson looked up from his paperwork, surprised. "Why?" Ruth hesitated, wondering if she should tell the truth. But the memory of that boy's face, of his confusion, was still fresh in her mind. "Because I don't want to work for people who let that kind of hate walk through their doors without saying a word." Mr. Wilson studied her for a long moment, then leaned back in his chair. "You're a brave girl, Ruth. But the world isn't going to change because you quit a job." "Maybe not," she admitted. "But I won't be part of it either." She left that day with no job and no plan, but with something more important, her dignity. Years later, Ruth left Ashford behind. She moved to Memphis, where the world was still cruel but at least had more places to hide. She got a job as a secretary working for a law office that fought civil rights cases. One day, as she sorted through files, she came across a familiar name: Wilson's pharmacy suit for refusing service to black customers. Ruth smiled, just a little. She hadn't changed the world that day in Ashford, but she had chosen who she wanted to be. And that, in the end, had made all the difference. Ruth Carter had promised herself that she would never go back to Ashford, Mississippi. She had spent too many years swallowing her pride, too many days watching her mother scrub the floors of people who wouldn't even look her in the eye, too many nights listening to her father sigh, knowing that no matter how hard he worked, it would never be enough. But life had a cruel sense of humor, and after 10 years in Memphis, Ruth found herself back on a bus heading toward the very town she had sworn to leave behind. The letter had arrived a week ago. Her mother was sick, the kind of sick that couldn't be cured with rest or medicine, the kind that meant Ruth had to come home. The town looked the same as it always had. The same cracked sidewalks, the same peeling paint on the storefronts, the same men standing outside the hardware store, pretending they weren't watching her as she walked past. Her mother's house was smaller than she remembered. The roof sagged a little, and the porch creaked beneath her feet as she stepped inside. "Baby girl," her mother whispered, her voice weak but warm. "I knew you'd come." Ruth pressed a kiss to her mother's forehead, ignoring the fear clawing at her chest. "I'm here, Mama, I'm here." The days passed in a blur of doctor visits, long nights, and quiet moments filled with unspoken words. But it didn't take long for Ruth to realize that Ashford hadn't changed. If anything, it had gotten worse. She saw it in the way the black-owned grocery store had closed down, replaced by a rundown gas station that charged twice as much for food. She saw it in the way the school her cousin's kids attended had textbooks from 20 years ago, while the all-white school across town had a brand new library. She saw it in the way people still lowered their voices when certain names were mentioned, as if racism only counted when it was shouted. And she saw it in the way Mr. Wilson's pharmacy still stood, its bright white sign untouched by time, as if the world outside its doors hadn't changed at all. She hadn't planned on stepping inside, but one afternoon, she found herself staring at the familiar storefront, her reflection staring back at her through the glass. The bell above the door jingled as she stepped inside. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, from behind the counter, a voice she hadn't heard in years. "Well, I'll be damned." Mr. Wilson looked older, His hair was thinner, his face more wrinkled, but his eyes still held the same sharpness she remembered. "Ruth Carter," he said, setting down the newspaper he had been reading. "Never thought I'd see you again." Ruth folded her arms, keeping her face neutral. "I didn't think I'd ever come back." Mr. Wilson chuckled. "No one ever does, but somehow, we all end up right where we started." She didn't respond. "How's your mother?" he asked. "She's sick," Ruth said simply. His expression softened, just a little. "I'm sorry to hear that." They stood in silence for a moment, the weight of the past pressing between them. "Still got folks coming in here who won't let a black girl serve them?" she asked finally. Mr. Wilson sighed. "Some things don't change." Ruth's jaw tightened. "Then maybe they should." He looked at her carefully. "You still got that fire in you, huh?" She held his gaze. "I don't know how to put it out." Mr. Wilson leaned forward, resting his elbows on the counter. "You ever think about coming back here for good?" Ruth blinked, caught off guard. "Why would I?" "Because people like you are the only ones who ever change anything." She laughed, but there was no humor in it. "People like me are the ones who get run out of town." Mr. Wilson didn't argue. But later that night, as she sat beside her mother's bed, watching her breathe, Ruth couldn't stop thinking about it. The next morning, she made a decision. She went to the town hall. She filled out the paperwork, and she bought the empty storefront down the road from Mr. Wilson's pharmacy. When people asked her what she was doing, she simply said, "Opening a clinic." The whispers started immediately. A black woman running her own clinic in Ashford? Unheard of, unacceptable. Some people laughed. Some people warned her to stay in her place. Some people said she would never last. But Ruth didn't care. She hired 2 black nurses from a nearby town. She stocked shelves with medicine that people in her neighborhood could actually afford. She offered free checkups for families who had never been able to afford a doctor. And slowly, people started coming. First, it was just a few mothers bringing their sick children, elderly men too proud to admit they needed help. Then more came. And more. The white folks in town weren't happy. She got threatening letters. The police inspected her clinic 3 times in 1 month, looking for a reason to shut it down. One night, she found a brick through her window, but she didn't stop. Because for every person who hated what she was doing, there were 10 more who needed her. And then, one evening, as she was locking up, she saw him. The little boy from all those years ago. He was older now, maybe 17, taller, stronger. He stood outside her clinic, hesitating. Finally, he stepped inside. "I don't know if you remember me," he said quietly. Ruth smiled. "I remember." He shifted on his feet. "My mama, she's sick, and we don't got money for a doctor." Ruth nodded. "Then let's see what we can do." He hesitated. She wouldn't want me coming here." Ruth met his eyes. "Then let's not tell her just yet." He exhaled, relieved. And in that moment, Ruth knew. Ashford hadn't changed, but maybe, just maybe, she was changing it. One patient at a time. The Mississippi River cut through the land like an old scar, winding through cotton fields, ghost towns, and cities built on the backs of men and women whose names had been forgotten. In the town of Briarwood, Mississippi, the past wasn't past. It was in the soil, it was in the air, and it was in the prison that stood like a fortress on the edge of town Parchment Farm. For nearly 100 years, the Mississippi State Penitentiary had been a place where black men disappeared. A place where the old slavery never died. Where prisoners were worked like mules, whipped like animals, buried in fields no one ever talked about. And now, Darius King was inside it. For a crime he didn't commit. And no one was coming to save him. Darius had been 19 when it happened. A football star. A kid with a future. Until the night a white girl screamed. The town had been waiting for a reason. Darius had been too successful, too fast, too young for them to ignore. He was the pride of Briarwood's black community, the boy everyone believed in, the one who was going to make it out. And they hated him for it. So when Maggie Albright, daughter of the town's richest man, ran out of a party sobbing and bleeding, it didn't matter what really happened. It didn't matter that Darius hadn't touched her. It didn't matter that he had spent the night with his friends, that dozens of people could vouch for him. Because Maggie pointed a shaking finger. And Darius was arrested before the sun came up. The trial lasted 1 day. The verdict took 5 minutes. Guilty. And just like that, Darius King, the boy who had once been Briarwood's future, was sentenced to 20 years in parchment. 20 years of backbreaking labor. 20 years of disappearing into a place where no one made it out the same. 20 years for something he hadn't done. And Briarwood moved on like it always did. But outside of town, in a house full of books and broken dreams, a woman sat waiting. Because if there was one thing Mama Ruth King knew, it was that the truth don't stay buried forever. And she was going to dig it up. She started with Maggie, the girl who had cried and pointed and ruined her son's life. Mama Ruth sat in the pew behind her in church, watched her shift in her seat, watched her glance over her shoulder as if feeling something crawl up her spine. Guilt was a ghost, and Mama Ruth was going to haunt her. Then there were the police reports. She made copies. She read the statements. And what she found, nothing added up. The times were wrong. The witnesses were all white. And the only person who had been ignored, the one friend who had been with Maggie that night, Avery Carter. A girl who had left town 6 months after the trial. A girl who had vanished. But Mama Ruth had been around long enough to know the truth always leaves a trail. And so she followed it. It took her 3 weeks to find Emily. She was in New Orleans, a waitress at a dive bar on the edge of the quarter. Mama Ruth sat at the counter sipping her coffee, waiting. And when Emily finally saw her, she froze. Because she knew they both did. Mama Ruth spoke first. "You lied, didn't you?" Emily's breath hitched. She turned to leave. Mama Ruth grabbed her wrist. "Tell me the truth." Emily's eyes filled with tears. And that was how Mama Ruth knew she had finally found it. The confession came in whispers. Emily had been there that night. She had seen what happened. She had seen who really hurt Maggie. And it wasn't Darius. It had been Ethan Albright, Maggie's own brother. But Maggie had been too scared to say it. Because Ethan was a white man in Mississippi. And Darius was a black boy with no power. So when the police came, when her father had whispered in her ear, she did what Briarwood had taught her to do. She chose a lie over the truth. She chose whiteness over justice. And Darius paid the price. Mama Ruth didn't cry. She had no tears left. Instead, she pulled a tape recorder from her purse and pressed play. Briarwood woke up to headlines. The story spread fast. Newspapers, radio stations, television crews rolling into town, shining a light on a case that was never meant to see daylight. And suddenly, Briarwood wasn't so sure about what it had done. The governor had no choice. The case was reopened. Darius's conviction was overturned. And after 4 years inside Parchment Prison, he walked out a free man. Broken, changed, but free. And standing at the gate, waiting for him, Mama Ruth. Because she had never stopped fighting, and she never would. Darius didn't want revenge, didn't want apologies. He just wanted to breathe. But Briarwood wasn't done with him. Not yet. Because the night he returned home, a cross burned on his mother's lawn. And a note was nailed to their door. Some boys don't deserve second chances. They wanted him gone. They wanted the silence back. But the problem with silence, it never lasts. Because this time, Briarwood wasn't just watching. The whole country was... And Darius King wasn't afraid anymore. So he picked up a microphone, stood in the middle of the town square, and he told his story loud, unapologetic, unbreakable. Ethan Albright was arrested 3 months later. Not because the town wanted it, but because the world demanded it. And for the first time in Mississippi's history, a white man was convicted of a crime against a black boy. Briarwood tried to move on, to forget, but Darius didn't let them. He stayed, built a community center, became the voice for every kid who had been told they wouldn't make it out. And Mama Ruth, she sat in the front row the day he was elected mayor. Because Briarwood had stolen his future, and now he was taking it back. The Mississippi air was thick with heat, pressing against the old streets of Briarwood like a weight no one could shake off. It had been 2 years since Darius King walked out of Parchment Prison. 2 years since Ethan Albright had been convicted. 2 years since Briarwood had been forced to reckon with the truth it had tried so hard to bury. But truth didn't fix everything. Truth didn't erase scars. And Mississippi didn't change over. Darius had stayed. Against all odds, against the threats, against the quiet war that Briarwood had been waging against him since the day he came home. He stayed, built something. The King Center stood in the heart of town Noah Place for the kids who had been told they weren't worth saving. A place where boys like him could see a future. A place that white Briarwood wanted gone. And now they had finally found a way to do it. It started with the letters. Official looking envelopes with government seals. Code violations. Zoning issues. Suddenly, the land that had been his mother's for 40 years was up for review. Then, the taxes. An accounting mistake that somehow meant he owed thousands of dollars in back taxes. Then, the whispers. Maybe he should leave while he still can. Some people just don't belong here. Wouldn't want something to happen to that nice little building of his. They were trying to push him out, to erase him. Again, but they had forgotten something. Darius King had spent 4 years in Parchment. He knew how to survive. His mother, Mama Ruth, sat across from him at the kitchen table, her Bible open but untouched. She watched as Darius flipped through the paperwork, his jaw clenched so tight it looked like it might snap. "They want to fight," he muttered. Mama Ruth didn't look up. "Then give it to him." Darius called a town meeting. Not at City Hall, that wasn't for people like them. No, he held it at the King Center. And when the people came, when the room was full of every single black man and woman in Briarwood who had been waiting for someone to fight back, he stood up and told them the truth. "They don't want us here," he said. "They never have." Silence. Then murmurs. A man in the back, Mr. Johnson, who had lost his land to a development project just last year, spoke up. "They took my farm, said they needed it for a new road, still ain't built it." A woman near the front, Miss Dolores, who had lost her son to the Briarwood police decades ago, nodded. "They think we don't know what they're doing." Darius exhaled. "Then it's time to show them we do." They filed a lawsuit against the Briarwood Zoning Board, against the county, against anyone who had been quietly moving the pieces to get rid of them. And when that lawsuit hit the press, Briarwood panicked, because this wasn't just about Darius anymore. It was about every black family they had pushed out of town for the past 50 years. And suddenly, Briarwood wasn't just a small Mississippi town. It was a national story. The threats got louder. This time, they didn't hide them in whispers. They spray painted "Get Out" on the King Center's walls, smashed the windows, left a dead raccoon on the doorstep, a message as old as the South itself. And then they set the building on fire. Darius got the call at 2:43 a.m. By the time he got there, flames were already eating through the walls. Smoke filled the night sky, thick and black, curling into the heat of the Mississippi air. The fire department came too late, of course. And as Darius stood there, watching everything he had built turn to ash, he knew this wasn't just about him. This was a warning. The police called it an accident. Said maybe it was kids messing around. Said there was no evidence of arson. Darius sat in the sheriff's office, staring at Sheriff Holden, the same man who had once tried to cover up his arrest. "You really think I'm that stupid?" Darius asked, voice cold. Holden leaned back in his chair. "I think you need to take a hint." Darius exhaled slowly. "You don't scare me, Holden." Holden's smile was lazy. "You should be." Mama Ruth didn't cry. Didn't break down when she saw the burned wreckage of the King's Center. She just stood there, silent. Darius turned to her. "What do we do now?" She reached into her purse, pulled out a small Bible, and threw it onto the pile of ashes. "Now," she said, voice like iron, "we rebuild." The donations came in from everywhere. From people who had never stepped foot in Briarwood but knew injustice when they saw it. From black churches across the country who had been fighting this fight long before Darius was born. From civil rights lawyers who were ready to burn this town to the ground in court. And when the money came in, so did the national news, SCNN, the New York Times. Every headline told the same story. Briarwood's dirty secret. How a town tried to bury a movement. And just like that, the mayor called a meeting. Darius walked into City Hall with his head held high. The mayor sat stiff-backed, his face pale. "We want to make this right," he said. Darius leaned forward, then dropped the case. Silence. The mayor exhaled. "Fine." Darius tilted his head. "And give us back our land." The mayor's jaw locked. "Darius, you want this to go away?" Darius said, voice sharp. "Then give us what you stole." A long silence. Then, "Fine." The King Center reopened a year later. Bigger, stronger, permanent. And this time, Briarwood knew they couldn't erase it. Because Darius King wasn't just a man. He was a movement. And now, he wasn't just staying. He was taking back everything they had ever stolen.